So these are some great questions about annotation and things that come up fairly frequently. So with the exclamation points that show up with the dimensions, what's happening is the points that they're associated with are becoming disassociated. So for example, if I take this string of dimensions and I simply use the move command to adjust the position, I'm going to get these exclamation points, and that's because these little dots here are no longer associated with the point that they were originally taken. So it's I highly recommend when you're repositioning dimensions that instead of moving, you either do a grip edit, so you just stretch it based on the grip, or if you're doing a string like this, you use the stretch command so that you can leave those points where they were. Now you can reassociate dimensions. So if I come in here and right click on the exclamation point, I get the option to reassociate. And it's going to give me the points one at a time, so I can see this little X here. I'm going to reselect that point, and then I'm going to reselect this point, and it's going to take that dimension back to where it was, and now it's associated with that point again. And that's handy because, for example, if I were to move what this is associated with, we generally don't edit this way, but if I were to move that, it's going to take the dimension with it, it can be really handy. So let me undo that part of it here. Now with leaders, you get the same thing. So if originally I selected this point to add this note, and then I move my note, I get the same thing happening. With leaders, it's a little bit different because you don't always want it pointing to an exact point. So I don't worry as much about those being unassociated or disassociated. Now, if you just don't want to see the exclamation points, you can come down here to this plus sign at the bottom. This is the anno monitor. You can turn it off and then you won't see them. But again, with the dimensions, I really recommend keeping those points right where they were originally taken. So that's that question. For the dimensions and text disappearing, 9 times out of 10 it's because the annotation scale of the dimensions and text doesn't match the annotation scale of the viewport. So if right now I've got my dimensions and my leader here set to 1/4 of an inch equals a foot, and I can see that in the properties menu here. If I go into paper space, I've got a viewport here, and the annotation scale and the standard scale are both set to 1/4 of an inch equals a foot. So I'm seeing that text in that viewport because it matches. Now if I change the viewport scale and change it to 1/8 of an inch equals a foot, it's going to disappear because it no longer matches. Now the standard scale controls how big the plan is on the sheet. The annotation scale controls which text is showing. So you want to make sure, you always want to have those two be the same, but it's the annotation scale that really controls which dimensions and text you're seeing. So you can adjust the, either adjust the viewport scale so that it matches what your text is set to, or if you need to change the scale of the dimensions or the text, you can simply come in and select it, go into properties, click on the line, click on the button. You can add a scale, so I'm going to add 1/8 of an inch equals a foot, and you can delete 1/4 if you're not using that. Click OK, and then if I come back into paper space and change my dimension or my scale, I'm going to get those dimensions are going to show up. You'll notice my leader still disappeared because I didn't change that, but you can also change the scale on that. Now the other thing that sometimes happens if it's not the scale matching issue is that a layer gets frozen in the viewport, and we use that a lot to control our views of the plans. So if you click into the viewport so that it's active and go into layer properties, look for this VP freeze column. If, for example, my dimensions layer is frozen in that viewport, even if my scale matches, it's not going to show. Now, the student also mentioned that they have the annotation button on, and I'm going to guess it may be this one down here. Right now I've got it set to only show the annotation objects at the scale that I'm working at. So, and that's what you want to do in Paperspace. If you turn this on so that it's always showing, so now it's showing all annotation objects. If I go back in now and unfreeze that layer, what's going to happen is it's going to show it's showing me two different scales. So it's showing me what's at 1/8 of an inch. It's also showing me what's at 1/4 of an inch. So I definitely don't recommend having that turned on in Paperspace. You want to only be seeing the annotation that is appropriate for the scale that you're working at. So we're going to see the one-to-one text that's on our title block, and then just whatever is correct for the scale of the viewport. Now, I do like having it on in model space because sometimes it's handy to be able to see, if you've got some elevations off to the side and you've got those at a different scale, to be able to see the different scales. But I would turn that off in Paperspace. So hopefully that helps. If not, let me know, and I'm happy to suggest something else.